In 1873, the United States Congress passed a law that would destroy the livelihoods of millions of American farmers. It wasn't called the Farmer Destruction Act, it was called the Coinage Act of 1873, and for decades afterward, it would be known as the Crime of 1873. This law quietly removed silver from the American monetary system, triggering the most brutal deflation in American history. Between 1873 and 1896, prices fell by nearly 40%. Debts became impossible to repay. Farms were foreclosed by the tens of thousands. An entire generation of farmers was ruined. This is the story of how silver was demonetized, and how that demonetization transferred wealth from farmers and workers to bankers and creditors on a scale never seen before or since in American history. To understand the crime of 1873, you need to understand the monetary system that existed before it. From 1792 until 1873, the United States operated on a bimetallic standard. Both gold and silver were legal money. You could mint either gold coins or silver coins at the U.S. Mint, and both circulated freely. The ratio was set by law at 16:1. 16 ounces of silver equaled 1 ounce of gold in monetary value. This ratio wasn't perfect. Sometimes the market ratio differed from the legal ratio. When silver was undervalued legally, people would melt down silver coins and sell the metal at market prices. When gold was undervalued, people would do the same with gold coins. But the system worked reasonably well for 80 years. And it had one critical feature that would later be lost. It created a moderate, predictable inflation that benefited farmers and debtors. Here's why that mattered. In the 19th century, most Americans were farmers, and most farmers were debtors to buy land, equipment, and seed. Farmers borrowed money. They took out mortgages. They bought supplies on credit. When you're a debtor, moderate inflation is your friend. If prices rise by 2 or 3% per year, your debt becomes easier to repay. The wheat you sell next year will fetch a higher price than the wheat you sold this year, but the debt you owe remains fixed. Over time, inflation erodes the real value of debt. This is why farmers loved silver. Silver was abundant. New silver discoveries in Nevada, Colorado, and other western states meant that the silver supply was growing. As more silver entered the monetary system, prices rose gently. Not enough to cause chaos, but enough to help farmers pay off their debts. Gold, on the other hand, was scarce and controlled by Eastern bankers. Gold meant tight money, falling prices, and crushing debt burdens. Gold meant foreclosures and bankruptcies. Gold meant wealth flowing from farmers to creditors. By the 1870s, this conflict between silver and gold had become a battle between two Americas. On one side were farmers, workers, and small businessmen in the South and West. They wanted silver money. They wanted inflation. They wanted their debts to become easier to pay. On the other side were bankers, bondholders, and creditors in the East. They wanted gold money. They wanted deflation. They wanted the money they were owed to buy more in the future than it bought today. In February 1873, Congress passed the Coinage Act. The bill was over 100 pages long. It reorganized the U.S. Mint. It changed various technical procedures for coin production. It was, by all appearances, a routine administrative reform. Buried deep in the bill was a single provision. It removed the silver dollar from the list of coins that could be minted. The standard silver dollar, which had been legal money since 1792, was quietly eliminated. Most members of Congress didn't notice. The bill passed with little debate. President Ulysses S. Grant signed it into law, and for the next few years, almost no one realized what had happened, but slowly the consequences became clear. Without silver dollars being minted, the money supply tightened. Gold became the only monetary metal, and gold was scarce. Between 1873 and 1879, the United States went through a severe depression. It was called the Long Depression at the time. Unemployment soared, businesses failed, railroads went bankrupt, and most devastatingly, farm prices collapsed. Wheat prices fell from $1.60 per bushel in 1873 to 49 cents per bushel in 1894. Cotton prices fell from 15 cents per pound to less than 5 cents per pound. Corn, which had sold for 64 cents per bushel in 1873, sold for 21 cents per bushel in 1896. Imagine you're a farmer in Kansas in 1873. You borrowed $1,000 to buy your farm. You expected wheat prices to stay stable or rise slightly, as they had for decades under the Bimetallic system. You calculated that you could pay off your debt over 10 years by selling about 16 bushels of wheat per year. But then the Coinage Act takes effect. Silver is demonetized. The money supply contracts. Prices begin falling. By 1896, you need to sell 50 bushels of wheat to pay what you used to pay with 16 bushels. But you're only growing the same amount of wheat. You can't triple your output, so you default on your debt. The bank forecloses. You lose your farm. This happened to hundreds of thousands of farmers. The 1880s and 1890s saw wave after wave of farm foreclosures. Entire communities were devastated. Rural poverty became widespread. The American farmer, who had been relatively prosperous under bimetallism, became desperate under the gold standard. And here's the crucial point. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't the result of natural market forces. This was the deliberate consequence of a policy decision. The government had changed the rules of money in a way that enriched creditors and impoverished debtors. By the late 1880s, farmers began to understand what had been done to them. They called it the crime of 1873. They demanded that silver be monetized. They formed political movements, the most important being the Populist Party, to fight for free silver. The Populists understood that the monetary system wasn't neutral. It wasn't a technical detail that economists should decide in isolation. It was a political question that determined who would prosper and who would suffer. In 1896, the conflict over silver reached its climax. The Democratic Party, under pressure from populists, nominated William Jennings Bryan for president. Bryan was 36 years old. He was a brilliant orator, and he made the fight for silver the centerpiece of his campaign. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Bryan delivered what would become the most famous speech in American political history. It was called the Cross of Gold speech. In it, Bryan defended farmers and workers against the gold standard that was crushing them. He said, "We have petitioned, and our petitions have been scorned. We have entreated, and our entreaties have been disregarded. We have begged, and they have mocked when our calamity came. We beg no longer. We entreat no more. We petition no more. We defy them." And then came the climactic moment. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The crowd erupted. Delegates stood on chairs, waving banners, shouting. Bryan became the Democratic nominee on the strength of that single speech. And for the next 4 months, the 1896 election became a referendum on silver versus gold, farmers versus bankers, the West and South versus the East. Bryan traveled the country by train, giving speech after speech. He spoke to enormous crowds in small towns. He warned that if gold remained the sole monetary standard, the concentration of wealth would continue, farmers would continue to lose their land, and democracy itself would be threatened by the power of financial elites. On the other side, the Republican candidate, William McKinley, barely left his home in Ohio. He didn't need to. He had the support of every major bank, every major corporation, and every major newspaper in the East. They poured unprecedented amounts of money into the campaign, warning that Bryan's silver policy would destroy the economy, cause hyperinflation, and bring financial ruin. McKinley won, not by a huge margin but decisively. Bryan carried the South and West, the regions where farmers predominated. But McKinley carried the Northeast and Midwest, where industrial workers feared that inflation would erode their wages. The defeat of Bryan in 1896 was the defeat of silver. It was the defeat of bimetallism. It was the final victory of gold and the creditor class. In 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, officially making gold the sole monetary standard of the United States. The crime of 1873 was never corrected. Silver was never demonetized. The deflation of the late 19th century permanently transferred wealth from farmers and debtors to bankers and creditors. But the story doesn't end there, because the conflict between silver and gold, between inflation and deflation, between debtors and creditors, never really ended. It just took on new forms. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created. It was supposed to provide an elastic currency, to prevent the kind of monetary contraction that had devastated farmers in the 1870s and 1880s. But as we've seen with the Great Depression and other crises, the Fed has often failed to live up to that promise. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard domestically. Americans could no longer own gold. The government confiscated gold and revalued it from $20 per ounce to $35 per ounce, creating instant inflation. This was, in effect, a delayed victory for the silverites and populists of the 1890s. In 1971, Richard Nixon ended the international gold standard. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except government decree. This completed the process that began with the crime of 1873. Money was no longer tied to any commodity. It became entirely a creature of government policy. Today we live in a world where central banks can create unlimited amounts of money with the push of a button. This would have been unimaginable to the farmers of the 1890s. They wanted moderate inflation through silver coinage. We have massive inflation through quantitative easing, but the fundamental conflict remains the same. Who benefits from monetary policy? Who suffers when the Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars? Who receives that money first, and who sees their savings eroded by inflation? The crime of 1873 teaches us that monetary policy is never neutral. It always benefits some groups at the expense of others. In the 1870s and 1880s, the gold standard benefited creditors at the expense of debtors. Today, Federal Reserve policy benefits asset owners at the expense of wage earners. The farmers of the 1890s understood this. They saw clearly that the demonetization of silver was not a technical reform but a political act that enriched one class at the expense of another. They organized, they fought back, they came within a few votes of winning, but they lost. And the pattern established in 1873 of using monetary policy to redistribute wealth upward has never been broken. From the crime of 1873 to the gold standard to the Federal Reserve to modern quantitative easing, the story is always the same. Those who control money use that control to benefit themselves. William Jennings Bryan lost the 1896 election, but his diagnosis was correct. The gold standard was a cross upon which labor was crucified. The demonetization of silver was a crime, and the farmers who lost their land to deflation were victims of a deliberate policy choice, not victims of inevitable economic forces. The crime of 1873 destroyed farmers' money. It transferred wealth from rural America to urban creditors. It established a monetary system that privileged gold and the bankers who controlled it. And though silver was eventually replaced by paper money and then by digital money, the pattern of using monetary policy to benefit the few at the expense of the many continues to this day. This is the story of how silver was demonetized, not through honest debate, not through democratic process, but through a 100-page bill that no one read, passed in the middle of a routine legislative session, with a single provision buried deep in the text that would change American history, the crime of 1873, a law that destroyed farmers' money, and a reminder that monetary policy is always political, always contested, and always determines who will prosper and who will suffer.